1917 revolution was a watershed in his never-ending quest for finding the spiritual in art, and that leading him to produce sublime metaphysical works like this in pure abstraction. And then there was the maverick Casimir Maravich, who shook the art world in 1915 with his painting A Black Square. Little did he realize what it represented, of course, was sweeping away, wiping out everything that had gone before, laying the groundwork for a new order. Little did he realize that just 2 years later, his fulfillment would be in the form of the Bolshevik Revolution of 1917. And then there's the poetic dreamer, the Russian Jewish artist, Marc Chagall. And for him, the events of the early 20th century were simply just more blips in the long history of his people and the turbulent history that they had had, to which he responded by simply floating above it all. So what do we know? The background to all this, the revolution didn't occur out of the blue. Russia was a vast and largely uninhabited country, and as a consequence of that, it was a turbulent place as different groups tried to assert themselves and establish a nationhood. The earliest settlers in Western Russia, as we now know it, were the Slavic tribes, who were pagans, bringing with them their customs and their pagan beliefs. And then in 850, two Byzantine missionaries, St. Cyril and St. Methodius, came from Thessalonica in Greece, bringing with them the Greek alphabet, which when they arrived in what's now Western Russia, they adapted to accommodate the Slavic tongue, because it was their wish to Christianize the Slavs, but to do so they wanted to translate the Bible into Slavic language, and that's how the Cyrillic alphabet came about, essentially Greek modified to accommodate Slavic sounds. And as they did so, they Christianized the population, and hence we have the beginning of the Russian Orthodox Church, which is essentially Byzantine, because that's where they came from, but also with Roman Catholic elements and also some pagan beliefs thrown in. The tribes settled down and they came together in a confederation, the Orange area there, together with some Nordic tribes that came down, and we're looking now at around 900 AD. And they agreed to form a loose confederation based on the city of Kiev, now in Ukraine, and that was known as the Quirian Ruse. And that began to flourish as a cohesive society, the nucleus of the Russia to be. But in 1240, as we discovered yesterday, the Mongols were descending through China, sweeping through Asia, sweeping towards Western Europe, sweeping right through the Quirian Rus, which they then dominated, and appointed local Kievan princes to administer the territory, but still beholden to their Mongol overlords. And this set up the scene, really, for rivalry between the various Russian princes that went on for several hundred years, culminating, in fact, with the rise of one of the princes, Ivan IV, who dominated the others, taking power of the whole region and declaring himself the Tsar of all the Russias. And Ivan was ruthless and ambitious and cruel, earning him the name, of course, of Ivan the Terrible, knowing that he had killed his enemies rather than imprison them, and it even said that he had killed his own son, whom he viewed as a potential rival. Ivan died, leaving no successor, and as always happens in that situation, rival groups vie for power. And this is the period in which Boris Godunov became for a while Tsar during this transitional period of palace intrigue and re-intrigue. And if you ever had the chance to go to a performance of Mussorgsky's opera, Boris Godunov, it gives you a wonderful sense of being immersed in the palace coups that were taking place all around. And if there's no production available, then do try to find at least a synopsis of the plot, and it immerses you totally in this period of Russian history. But things finally stabilized when the Romanov dynasty came into being in around 1600, and the most important of the early Romanov Tsars was, of course, Peter the Great. Peter was very shrewd, and he understood how power worked, and he wanted to retain power, but he was afraid of the nobles, the boyars, so-called in Russian, who still carried a lot of sway. But he dominated them, kept them in their order, and he then concentrated on the expansion of the Russian Empire. And it was a largely empty terrain, in much the same way we saw the Muslim migration across North Africa at great speed from the death of Muhammad 30 years, 60, 90 years on, reaching the Atlantic Ocean because it was sparsely populated. So it was with Russia, and it was not all that difficult, I suspect, for Russia to reach the Pacific Ocean with Peter's expansion and also approaching the West. He wanted an outlet onto the Baltic. Why? Because Europeans were the major powers of the day, and he wanted a window on Europe, facing Europe, so he could regard Russia as not only an Asian, but also a European power. Everything in red there is what Peter obtained from the Rus that we saw a little earlier, just some few hundred years earlier. Russia was now the largest single country in the world. He established a capital, a new capital. Moscow had originally been where the Mongols had established their own headquarters in Moscow rather than Kiev to establish their dominance. But now Peter moved the capital to the marshy area on the Baltic facing Europe, which we now know as St. Petersburg. And that became the capital of Russia and did so until the 1917 revolution. But here, the seeds of revolution were already being sown. Why? Because Russia was largely underpopulated, and the population that was there was rural, it was basically illiterate, the terrain was hard, the climate was harsh, the growing season was short, and famines were frequent. There was also very poor communication. And as a result, you had a disenfranchised population of serfs, not the same as slaves. Slaves were property, like the horse and cart and your sofa. You could buy and sell a slave if you were in the Americas at the time. Serfs were different. They were an integral part of the estate. They could not be sold independently. They were part of the estate. And when the estate changed hands, so the serfs changed hands with them. But obviously there are parallels between the two systems. So here you had this population, underserved, sparse, illiterate, often the subject of famine. By contrast, Peter, now facing Europe, saw Russia as a rival to the splendor of the courts of Europe, particularly that of France. And he established a rich, wealthy, overindulgent court living way beyond its means. And there, I think, we have the seeds planted of the 1917 revolution back in 1600. Peter died without a successor, and as happened in England with Queen Anne not having any progeny, the genealogists had a task to find somebody who at least carried some semblance of a bloodline to perpetuate the monarchy. And so it was in Russia. And they eventually fell upon a German duke whose wife was Catherine and persuaded him to come to St. Petersburg to assume the Tsardom, which he did. Within 6 months of becoming Tsar, he mysteriously died, almost certainly murdered, and the prime suspect was his very capable and ambitious wife, Catherine. They had a son, so by rights, the succession should have gone from this rather inept Tsar, who ruled for 6 months. The succession should have gone to their son, but it didn't, and legitimately or illegitimately, Catherine seized the throne. But she was very bright, very ambitious for Russia, and she expanded the empire to now include Lithuania, East Poland, and on the Pacific side, across the Bering Strait into North America, what is now Alaska. All this was now part of the great Russian Empire under Catherine. She was also favored enormously the European Enlightenment, and she was a great patron of the arts, and it's from Catherine that we have the nucleus of the Hermitage collection in St. Petersburg today. She made one fatal error, and that was, whereas Peter had the wisdom to keep the boyars, the nobles, in order, Catherine saw the boyars as being ideally placed, distributed throughout the Russian Empire, closely physically related to the serfs who were restless, and she gave the power back to the boyars so that they could then ruthlessly suppress any serf uprising. And now we're beginning to see the seeds of the revolution being germinated through the action of that one action of Catherine. She was eventually succeeded not by her son, which by right she should have given the throne to in the first place, or at least succeeded her, but to her grandson. And he was somewhat dithering because now Napoleon was on the march in Europe, and the question now was, would Russia ally with the Allies, or would Russia ally with Napoleon? And he vacillated. First, he allied himself with Napoleon, and then he thought, well, it was probably in Russia's interest of the way the Napoleonic wars were working out that it would be best to be on the winning side, and so he shifted over to become an enemy of Napoleon, whereupon Napoleon turned on him, of course, and in 1912 marched with a huge army to Moscow. Arriving in the dead of winter, poorly equipped, only to find that the Muscovites had staged a strategic withdrawal, and the city was completely empty. No food for them to take, and Napoleon had no choice but to return back to Paris, which he finally did with just 1/10 of the army of 750,000 men with which he set out from Paris years earlier. And the loss of the men was partly battles on the way to Moscow and on the way back, but largely due to desertions, to starvation, a disease, and the cold. 1/10 of his army survived. Russia did well out of that strategic withdrawal, but then things didn't go too well a little later in the 1850s with Crimea. Russia wanted a presence on the world stage, and this meant access to the Eastern Mediterranean. And so the Crimea, situated at the north of the Black Sea, gave access through the Bosporus eventually to the Mediterranean, which the Allies wanted to thwart. And hence the Crimean War takes place. Russia was poorly equipped, soundly beaten, many, many casualties, wounded soldiers coming back, morale of the common people plummets as a result of that war, and so the fertilization of the revolution gets an extra boost. And then in 1881, completely out of the blue, to everybody's surprise, the observers in Europe, the new Tsar, Alexander II, is assassinated by a bomb thrower. And why this was such a surprise was that Alexander II was a reformer. He was trying to bring the serfs into the society by abolishing the concept of serfdom. Surely that was a good thing. Many other reforms as well. Why would the people rise up against him and hurl a bomb? Was it just a few fanatics, or was this something more sinister? And it was something more sinister. The problem was, when you abolish slavery, what do the slaves do? Well, they continue doing what they were, they just changed their names. For serfs, they didn't have that option. They were expelled from the land, and they flocked to the cities, which were now beginning to become belatedly industrialized. They were seeking work in the factories. Few of them could find work, and those that did were poorly paid, the conditions were dreadful, their living accommodation was worse, and the many, many others had no work at all. And this was the simmering discontent that Alexander II hadn't appreciated was awaiting for him with this bold move of abolishing serfdom. The authorities rounded up the conspirators as they could find them. The bomb thrower himself was actually killed in the explosion, and they were executed. Alexander II was succeeded by his son, who took the title Alexander III, who blamed the Jews for the assassination of his father, without any evidence at all, which unleashed the first of a series of pogroms in which hundreds of Jews were killed in their villages. He was succeeded eventually by his son. He died, Alexander III died of kidney failure at the age of 49, and he was succeeded by his son Nicholas II. And this brings us up to a time with which we're more familiar. And Nicholas ascended the throne in 1894, I think it was. And he was preoccupied now with a war that was going on between Russia and Japan. You remember Japan from Monday was becoming militarily ambitious, fighting a war with Korea and China and now Russia. And this was over the war was fought over Russia's assertion of a warm Pacific port, because the port of Vladivostok, which was unequivocally Russian territory, froze over for 8 or 9 months of the year. And now Russia wanted a warm port which threatened Japan, which was just off the coast, and hence the Russian-Japanese war. And Nicholas was preoccupied with this. What he hadn't appreciated what was going on was that political parties had been forming in the last decade of the 19th century, and there were 3 of them. The first political party, all 3 of them wanted to change the system. This couldn't go on. The first political party wanted to retain the monarchy, but wanted to convert it to a constitutional monarchy. But they were in a small minority. The second party, known as the Mensheviks, wanted to transform society eventually and gradually to a democratic republic. And then there were the Bolsheviks, coming from the Russian word Bolshoi, which simply means big or great. Why did they call themselves the Great Party, the Bolsheviks? Because they had infiltrated all the towns in Russia, setting up workers' councils in anticipation that one day they would take power. So they were well primed for what was going to follow. Nicholas's attention was finally grasped in 1905, in January, when a priest approached the palace in St. Petersburg with a petition from the people itemizing reforms that the people wanted. They were followed, the priest was accompanied by a large crowd that began to become unruly, whereupon Nicholas ordered the Cossacks to open fire on the crowd, fearing that they were going to storm the palace. And then all hell broke loose throughout the entire Russian Empire. Strikes, protests, civil disobedience, the economy for nearly a year ground to a halt. And part of that descent took place aboard this ship, the Battleship Potemkin. Sailors seizing control of the ship, killing some of the officers, and eventually taking the ship to safe harbor in the western end of the Black Sea in a port in Romania. Ostensibly, the cause was maggoty food that they were given to eat, but much deeper than that was the seething resentment of the people against authority, and this rebellion had taken place aboard this ship. And I'm sure many of you have seen Sergei Eisenstein's film, silent, black and white, flickering, but powerfully, enormously powerful, the Battleship Potemkin, made 20 years after the actual episode. And that, like Mussorgsky's opera on Boris Godunov, gives you a wonderful flavor of the times in 1905 when Russia was on the brink of revolution. Belatedly, Nicholas takes hold of the situation and declares there will now be a People's Representative Parliament, the Duma. And that stabilized the situation for a while. Then in 1914, Archduke Ferdinand of Austro-Hungary was assassinated in Sarajevo, you remember. And as a consequence of that, it was discovered that the assassin was a Slavic Serbian nationalist. Serbs and Slavs, cousins. Russians are Slavs, cousins. Nicholas then sends, knowing that the Serbian population is going to be attacked by the Austrians, sends in the Russian army to protect the Serbians, their fellow Slavs, and also does something fateful, and that is preemptively attacks Germany, knowing that Germany is going to come to the defense of Austria. And before you know it, through a tangle of alliances, the First World War breaks out. And this has a profound effect, of course, on the consequences to come. As the war goes badly, it does go badly for Russia, and as a consequence, war wounded are coming back, and many don't come back at all, more fertilization of the seeds of revolution. This is 1914, 1915, 16. And to whom does Nicholas turn for advice? Not his council of ministers, but to his wife's guru, Grigory Rasputin. A charismatic man, self-proclaimed holy man, and the sway that he held over the Tsar's wife was because he claimed to have the cure for their son's haemophilia. And that, of course, was a disaster. And now, in 1917, in order to get control of the situation, Nicholas now orders the strikers to return to work. They refuse, and then he orders the army to open fire on the strikers. The beginnings of the revolution of 1917. And the army, first of all, support Nicholas, but then seeing that this is a massive uprising and seeing that the cause of the workers is just in their eyes, they change sides, leaving Nicholas entirely isolated with no choice but to abdicate. And then the following year, of course, he's hunted down and together with his family assassinated. Germany, meanwhile, wants to get Russia out of the war, and it does so in a clever way. Germany sends a train from Germany to Switzerland to bring back the exiled leader of the Bolshevik Party, Vladimir Lenin, and brings him back to St. Petersburg, where he sets up a provisional government, forming eventually, after the various competing factions vie for who's going to dominate the new regime, forms the Soviet Union. And the Soviet Union is a union of 3 Soviet republics, Russia, Ukraine, and Belarus. And that was the origin of the Soviet Union, which of course then expanded. And then, of course, succeeded by Stalin. So that is the background to these artists. So let's get back to where we started. How did these 3 individuals from 3 entirely different backgrounds respond to this turbulent history? And here we have Kandinsky. And Kandinsky came from a privileged family. His father was a major beer importer a tea importer into Russia. They lived in Moscow. He was a highly gifted, highly intelligent man. And at the age of 6, he was already playing the cello and the piano, and then went off to Moscow University, where he did a degree in law and economics. And during that time he was studying, he did painting as a hobby. But primarily, his main artistic endeavor was in music. He was an accomplished musician as well as a great intellect. At the end of his university time, he was offered an opportunity through the Russian Anthropological Association to spend 3 years doing research on Russian folklore, which he did out in the countryside, making notes and drawings and everything to document Russian folklore in the region. And that became a document of record and is so today. He then returned to Moscow at the end of that time and completed his PhD thesis. And this is Kandinsky, The Legality of Labor's Wages, based on his joint law degree in law and in economics, his PhD thesis, which he finally obtained in 1893. He was then offered a professorship in a provincial university, which he declined, because now he thought he would like to explore painting as a career. He'd done it as a hobby. He just wanted not necessarily a career, but to know more about it. He was from a wealthy family, so there were no economic pressures on him at that time. And he goes off to Munich, which was a leading art center at the time, and there he starts painting, very much influenced by the folklore that he did on his 3-year sojourn for the Anthropological Society. And here we have 2 riders on horseback, and the way he paints is very interesting. To my eye, it looks almost as if he'd taken a handful of semi-precious jewels, or even real jewels, and scattered them on a black velvet cloth. Isn't that exactly what that looks like? And there the twinkling lights of Moscow in the background, very folkloric in style. And why this is so interesting is that color for Kandinsky was something very special. This is what drove him to painting. It wasn't the representation that interested him so much as portraying color and the emotional effect it had on him. And here now, again, from his folkloric studies, what he's done now is he has done a compendium, which he now calls in this painting a motley life. And it's characters from a whole collection of folk stories. We can see, for example, the Virgin Mary, bottom left there. Can you see there with the child? And if you follow up more towards the left top, the left hand, in the middle ground there, you can see a black-hatted, black-bearded priest in a saffron gown, before whom a man in green is bowing low. And there in the middle of the bottom of the picture, there's a man with a profuse green beard with a bundle on his back, a pilgrim who's coming into Moscow. And there on the far right, a golden-haired girl sitting on a rock playing a pipe. And there, way over on the left, in the middle of the field, right on the left edge there, you can see a girl running away from her suitor across the grass. And then if you look behind the suitor, you can see men on horseback and sticks waving around battles between various clans that, again, Kandinsky knew about from his history. And surveying the whole scene on the hill, the Kremlin looking down. A compendium of folk art, if you like, and this is how Kandinsky started off. In Munich, he really feels that this is what he wants to do, but meanwhile, he wants to be independent of his wealthy father, and so what he does is starts his own private art school. And among his pupils there, he's now 36 years old, and among his pupils is a young, she's 11 years his junior, Gabrielle Munter, a young artist who became an artist in her own right. And for Gabrielle, Kandinsky gives up Anna, the fellow student in Moscow University whom he had married. And then the two of them live together, and they visit the town of Murnau, which is just outside Munich as you go into the foothills of the Bavarian Alps, a pretty holiday village called Murnau. Impressed by Gauguin's use of color, patches of color that we'd seen, in turn influenced by the Japanese prints we talked about the other day, Kandinsky now starts painting a village scene. But for him, color is something more than just something that fills in a space of something that's represented. Look at the trees there on the right. And the color there seems to be you're not quite sure if that's a tree there or just a blob of yellow, green, and red. We're not quite sure. But this is how his mind is working. And now the next year, he takes Gabrielle up, and they look up, and they're up in the mountains, and there you can see the mountains. The sun is just setting. The sky is red there at the top. We're looking at a little village, some stylized houses on the left. There's a church tower, and in front of us we can see tombstones. And then a year later he returns, and now you can see that what it actually represents is becoming less and less important to Kandinsky. It's more the color itself that's speaking to him. The church tower's now 2 lines just going up to the top there. There are the tombstones in the front, but we can now see the color is leaving the tombstones as if they have a mind of their own. And a mind of their own is exactly how he sensed it. Kandinsky had a physiological condition that neurophysiologists call synesthesia. That is, one sensation in the brain triggers a reaction in which another sensation comes to the fore. And for Kandinsky, it was music. Music was, after all, his first love. And in music, he was listening one evening to an atonal work by Arnold Schoenberg. I don't know if you know Schoenberg's 12-note atonal music, but it really does consist of, for the uninitiated until you immerse yourself in his sound world, a succession of notes all going off in different directions. It so affected Kandinsky that when he listened to that, he was seeing colors. As the notes were being played, he saw a red and a green and whatever. He felt compelled to write to Dr. Schoenberg. And he wrote, "Dear Dr. Schoenberg, in your works, you have realized what I long for in music, the independent progress of individual voices," that's their notes, "to their own destinies," the notes going off in Schoenberg's atonal music. And then he says, "That is exactly what I try to find in my paintings, the colors going off to their own destinies." And so Kandinsky goes on the road that he really wants. And here he starts doing a whole series of paintings, and you can see in doing so, representation is still there at the beginning. Is this a black piano top? I think it probably is. Are those little black arches the keys of the piano? I think maybe, and there perhaps is the pianist in black with a circle round his head. But what happens when you play the keys? In Kandinsky's mind, you press the keys and colours float off the surface. And here we are. And this is an impression, a series of paintings he called impressions, the simplest of these constructions that he made. And then he goes on with more and more complex compilations, and then he does the first, 1912, the first true abstract painting in Western art. We're conditioned to try to identify things. We say, oh, look, there's a jellyfish at the top. Can you see? Purple jellyfish. And oh, look at the bottom left, there's a lizard. I'm sure that was nothing further from Kandinsky's mind, but that's how we're conditioned to look. But now he's just getting these shapes going off to their own destinies, the beginning of abstract painting in Western art. But then he finds himself in trouble, because how do you go on with this? And here he is. Gabriel Munter has a series of photographs, 4 black and white photographs taken over 4 different days when Kandinsky was painting this painting, which he calls Composition Number 7. And it starts off with blues and things and splodges, as you would expect in oil paint, and then the next day it gets another layer and another layer and another layer. Is this a cacophony of sound represented in painting? And I think it is. But art historians for the last 100 years have questioned, how do you interpret this? The truth of the matter is he'd boxed himself into a cul-de-sac now. Where do you go with art when you produce this? And at the end of the day, the bottom line is it's not really very satisfying. The 1917 revolution came just at this moment, which allowed Kandinsky a breathing space to find himself. How did he respond to the revolution? He responded, well, first of all, the First World War broke out and he had to leave Germany because Russia was now on the wrong side. And they part company. Munter goes off to Switzerland, and Kandinsky returns to Russia, which he had sorely missed. But how do you respond to the 1917 revolution, which took place 3 years after he arrived in Russia? After all, he was from a bourgeois family, wealthy, a large house, plenty of income, and the revolution was going to take all that away, and it did take it all away. So how did this man, highly intelligent, highly principled, respond to that? Bear in mind, his thesis was on the working conditions, the justification of wages for the working man. And for his research, for his PhD, he had, of course, read Karl Marx and was extremely sympathetic to the principles of Karl Marx. And so he was attuned to the principles of the revolution before it degenerated into what it became under Stalin. And he was an enthusiastic supporter of the revolution, even though his family had now lost its home and lost its wealth. He was already a known entity, having worked in Munich, which was a major art center, and so the regime co-opted him, because of his international reputation, to become director of the Moscow Museum of Art. And his brief there was to fill the museum with works of art as he saw fit. And being highly principled, of course, the art that Kandinsky saw fit didn't square with the ambitions of the regime, which wanted art to reflect favorably on the workers' paradise they were trying to create. Kandinsky, therefore, was relieved in 1922 when he got a letter from Walter Gropius, who had founded the Bauhaus School of Applied Arts and Architecture in Germany, in Weimar, inviting Kandinsky to come back to Germany, now the war was over, where he could join the faculty and practice his art freely, knowing that he was frustrated in this prestigious post that he held in Moscow. And so he joins the faculty in the Bauhaus, and what did the Bauhaus do for him? It gave him a sense of structure and order in his work, which clearly he had lost in that complicated picture that I think is just a visual representation of a cacophony of sound. And you can see now where he finally finds himself, thanks to the revolution indirectly. He never returned to Russia. He felt passionately about Russia and was sad because of that. And then in 1933, when Hitler comes to power, the Bauhaus is closed down. He goes to France. And what does he paint towards the end of his life? Do you remember those riders, the jewels scattered on the black velvet? Here we have the Bauhaus-influenced biomorphic shapes, mostly geometric, which was the aesthetic of the Bauhaus at the time, superimposed on this folkloric background. Full circle for Kandinsky, thanks, I think, to the revolution. What about Casimir Maravich? Another man who shared passionately Kandinsky's devotion to the sanctity of the artist and that art should serve a higher purpose. Higher is comparative, it's not absolute, but in respect to the regime, certainly artists should not be kowtowing to the regime. He was a Ukrainian, and he identified with the earth, very sympathetic to the revolution from that respect. But he was a Ukrainian, his father worked in a sugar beet factory, and he wanted to be an artist, and he went off to Moscow, and there he saw what was going on. He immersed himself initially in his painting exactly the same way that Kandinsky had, in Ukrainian folk art. I don't know if you're a collector of Ukrainian painted eggs, but that's exactly what they looked like, these gaudy colors and forms. And what Maravich has painted here is the dryads, the mythical tree creatures, and you can see they're all scattered all over this folkloric picture. Very paralleled, I think you would agree, with how Kandinsky started out himself. In Moscow, Malevich goes to the museums to see what's there. Not much is coming in yet, but there is a private collection with Sergei Shukin, who was a Russian industrialist who'd spent much of his fortune acquiring the avant-garde, cutting-edge art of Paris, and in fact was the sponsor of the dancers. Matisse commissioned Matisse to do the dancers, a huge canvas, which you may have seen in Washington, D.C. and in the Museum of Modern Art. And Shukin commissioned Matisse to paint those for either side of his grand staircase in his large villa in Moscow. And the walls were crowded with everything you could imagine from the late 19th century French avant-garde painters, among which was, of course, the scenes, the west wall of Rouen Cathedral by Claude Monet, the serial effects of light. And Maravich saw these and was very taken by them, because Shukin opened his house, a private house, several times a year to the general public for a short period, where you can come and see these works. And here's Maravich now copying this. He finds a church in Moscow behind some trees and very much copies Monet's technique, as you can see there. He also sees there Seurat, Georges Seurat's painting Afternoon on the Grand Jatte, which is in the Louvre. I'm not sure which museum it's in. It may be the Museum of Modern Art in New York. Huge painting, I'm not sure where it is. Huge painting, and painted in muted colors. The Grand Jatte, of course, is an island on the Seine, just outside Paris, and the ladies have been to church in the morning, they're in their Sunday best, and they're spending a leisurely Sunday afternoon. Malevich is a maverick with a wicked sense of humor. And rather than just copying that he did for the Monet, the Rouen Cathedral, he satirizes this picture. And instead of pale colors, in-your-face green, and there are the ladies all in their white gowns besporting themselves, the gentlemen in their top hats. One of them, at least at the top there, has the dignity to turn his back to us as he's urinating. His heart, though, is in the peasant. Like Michelangelo and like Diego Rivera, the monumentality of the common man here was important. For Michelangelo, of course, it was the sanctity of the human form, but monumental figures. And Malevich then does a series of paintings of peasant life, a peasant woman, no shoes, her child, a bundle on her back. Difficult to think that when he painted this, he wasn't influenced by Picasso's Demoiselle d'Avignon. If you look at the face there, you can see a resemblance. Picasso had been working on that quietly for several years before it was finally, his studio was finally open to the public and it was seen for the first time. And he'd also read Cézanne's documents on the structure of objects in painting. And he's trying to find the structure here of the woodman, very much like Fernand Léger did exactly the same. Wood is cylindrical. There we can see logs of wood, and there's the woodman with his saw cutting through the logs, looking as though he himself is constructed out of logs, the cylindrical forms. So he's trying to find his way. And now he's approached by a couple of his buddies who want to mount an opera what they call a futurist opera, which is going to be sung in an entirely new language called Zum. What is Zum? It is exactly as you expect, a complete nonsense language. He is commissioned with designing the sets and these bizarre costumes, and they come on and the singers come on, it's done public performance, and they sing away in this complete nonsense. The audience walk out, the critics pan it completely, and then when Malevich and his colleagues are asked, why on earth are you doing this? He said, this is because we protest the banality of contemporary opera. In other words, 10 years ahead of the Dada movement, which started in Switzerland later on, there they are, the first Dadaists, sticking it to the establishment. First World War breaks out, and Malevich now is asked if he wouldn't mind doing some illustrations for a book of anti-German war poems. And so he, tongue-in-cheek, he obliges, and in the Russian, at the bottom there, it says in the legend there, a Russian peasant with a scythe makes short work of German soldiers. And there you can see their heads rolling across the fields. And so he really is, he sticks it to the authorities and he just does his own thing. And then, seriously, he comes up with this painting. Why did he paint it? It was plain black. The little whites you see there is simply the paint that's cracked over time. Pure black. Tabula rasa, eliminating what had gone before in the same way that the Zum opera was trying to eliminate opera that went before by replacing it with nonsense. The black square of opera, if you like, is what he'd just performed in. And here's the black square replacing it. Some others thought, well, he's a maverick, surely it's just the anarchists' black banner. Not so. I think he was after something much more important. And this was not the first abstract painting, because we saw that just a moment ago with Kandinsky. This is the first conceptual painting, leading to whom? Marc Rothko. The beginning of the concept, the whole American abstract expressionists following the Second World War. And so he was a very important figure. Around the same time, other artists in Russia were doing their own thing as well. And there were the Constructivist Movement, who very much were using simple things, cardboard, paper, but geometry was their key word. And now, tongue-in-cheek, Malevich copies the Constructivists here doing, the Constructivists would have had all these rectangles absolutely lined up nicely at 90 degrees angles. And what's Malevich do? They're not quite rectangles, they're all slightly trapezoid, all slightly at an angle. And then he does another one here, very much first sight. Oh, look, he's doing constructivist painting, not original at all. He's copying what his buddies are doing in Moscow. Not at all. He calls this an aeroplane in flight, which, of course, the constructivists wouldn't have dreamed of doing. And, of course, there it is. There's the aeroplane in red, passing behind the cloud, leaving behind it a vapor trail. And now he does this other one in the constructivist vocabulary. Shapes, you can see, ellipsoids, triangles, circles, segments of circles, rectangles. But if you look at it aesthetically, it's very pleasing, I think. You can see this sort of floating around in space. And it's his way, I think, of anticipating space travel. And then in 1918, he does his white-on-white picture here. And this is what replaces the black square. It's a white square, as you can see. It's not quite square because it's by Malevich. It's slightly angled, but it's placed on another white, which is of a slightly warmer tone. And that, of course, is open to a whole lot of questions as to why he painted that. But this is the conceptual art that he's introducing. The regime want him, of course, to paint things that are important. He's already got an international reputation, so the 1917-1918 Soviet regime now has a problem on its hands, because if they were to attack him for doing this rebellious art, that would not reflect well on the society that they're trying to create. But on the other hand, they can't allow subversion. So the regime is caught. Malevich will stay true to his principles, as we'll see in a moment. But he was disappointed that his favorite pupil, the most gifted pupil, Lev Lisitsky, had actually succumbed to the pressures of the regime and did this propaganda piece here, which he called "The Reds Will Overcome the Whites." The Reds, of course, being the Bolsheviks and the Whites the Mensheviks. So his favorite pupil, whom he was promoting, had betrayed the principles of art that he had tried to inculcate in him. So what does an artist of principle actually do in this regime? Kandinsky, as we saw, opted out. He did his best, 3 years diligently trying to please the authorities, but eventually gave up. What does Malevich do? He stays, and he tries to work within the system. Collectivization has now replaced the agriculture, and the small tenant farmer now is simply just an automaton working for the regime. So he paints a peasant, and he paints the peasant with no mouth. Can't speak, can't protest, do what you're told. He then paints 3 farm girls in exactly the same way, metallic automatons, no faces really, just there doing the calling of the regime. There's a gardener. Here at least he gives the gardener a potential weapon, one of his tools, but that's a little bit subtle. And now he paints 3 farm workers. Not only do they have no mouth to speak, they have no eyes to see, so they can't comment on what's going on, they can't even observe what's going on, and they certainly have no arms to act. And this is Malevich's response to the authoritarian Soviet regime demanding art that will glorify their regime. They do, though, have their beards, and their beards represent their virility and their manhood. And so there, the regime finally cottons on to what he's all about. And they are caught in this vice. Do we imprison him? Do we send him to Siberia? That hadn't quite come in yet with Stalin, but it was on its way. And they compromise. They arrest him, and he's put in prison for 2 weeks. And he comes out of prison, and he learns his lesson. He doesn't want to be in prison, but on the other hand, an artist of integrity, he will remain faithful. So what he does, he says, well, I'm going to do portraits. You can't go wrong with portraits. The regime won't criticize me for doing portraits. So he does. And here's a farm girl, now with her face restored, her arm restored, muscular arm, as you can see. But he's subversive to the last. He gives her a red gilet to wear. That will please the regime. But he also puts on her head a blue cap and a yellow skirt, the national colors of pre-revolutionary Ukraine. She's holding her hands in a peculiar way. Why is she holding her hands that way? Oh, it looks as though she's holding a baby. Where's the baby? What does the baby represent? The baby represents the future. In the present system, he sees no future, no baby. Subtle. And now he paints himself towards the end of his career as a Renaissance nobleman. There he is, proud, looking forward. There's no way the censors can criticize him for this. Pure Renaissance painting revisited. Not so. Look at his hand. Thumb up, fingers outstretched. Do the same with your other hand and turn it round. And what do you have? You have a square. What does that remind you of? And in case you can't remember, look at the very bottom right-hand corner. You can see his black square painting. There we are. So let me just quickly now introduce you to our dreamer. Moshe Chagall was his name. Vitebsk in now Belarus, the oldest child of 9 of a poor Jewish family, and he was determined to become a painter. Why? Because his father was a drudge in his eyes. His father would drive a horse and cart loaded with barrels of salt herring, which he would drive around the community. And he wanted something much more exotic than that. He wanted to be a painter. The Jews at the time, he was from an Orthodox Jewish family living in Vitebsk. Vitebsk, you can see, this is in the Pale of Settlement, so-called. As the Russian Empire expanded westward, it incorporated a large settled Jewish community in Eastern Europe and absorbed them into the Russian Empire. And it was Catherine the Great who declared that the Jews must remain confined to a particular corner of Russia in the southwest, which is known as the Pale of Settlement. And I always wrestled with what is meant by a pale. It's an Old English word simply meaning a boundary marker. And so the Jews were confined there, and you could only travel outside that with special permission. And with special permission, you could, but you had to be university educated and particularly wealthy in order to be able to live in St. Petersburg or Moscow. And so there they were in Vitebsk. Now, Vitebsk itself, the color scheme there shows the Jewish population in the Pale of Settlement. And growing up, I had thought that they were all the Jews lived there. Not at all. 90% of the population were just regular Russians who lived there. And the Jewish population of the Pale of Settlement was about the order of 10%, according to those colors. Vitebsk itself was a prosperous town. It was an economic town, also something of a cultural center, living on a river, prominent buildings, churches, and even had its own cathedral and an art gallery. The Jews, on the other hand, didn't live in town. They lived in a township, which is familiar to us all here, of course. And in Yiddish, that's called a shtetl, or a small town. The houses there were made of wood, often tumbled down, streets unmade, little alleyways. And the Chagall family were members of an Orthodox Hasidic sect which valued learning above many other things in life, but also weren't afraid to have a drink, sing a song, and do a dance. So these were happy, joyful of those zealous religious Jews. And this is the background he came from. And there he finds the local village painter there, Yehuda Penn, who gives him some lessons. Yehuda Penn was the only really established painter in that area, and he painted the local Jewish community here, the local clockmaker, reading a paper. You can see we talked about Maimonides writing in Hebrew, but actually writing in Arabic, but Hebrew letters. And here's a Yiddish paper written in Hebrew characters, the Yiddish being a colloquial form of German, the primary language of many of the poorer Jews who lived in Russia at the time. And now this is some of the artwork that he's doing, and Penn arranges for him to go to Moscow, to go to St. Petersburg, where Penn writes a letter of introduction to the leader of the very small but very influential Jewish community in St. Petersburg, who was a lawyer and a member of the Duma. So Jews were integrated into society to some extent there, but a wealthy, well-positioned man. Because young Moshe Chagall didn't have a permit or a passport to go to St. Petersburg, he went clandestinely with a friend. And then before going, he does one of these sentimental pictures there. You can see a wedding, father giving away the bride. Front of the procession is the rabbi, and there's a fiddler leading the procession along. His contact in St. Petersburg secures him a year in St. Petersburg Academy of Art, where he learns the basics of painting, and then he's attached to Leon Bakst, who is one of St. Petersburg's leading painters, something of a proto-surrealist, as you can see. And he went on to do the sets for Diaghilev's Ballet Russe that they then took on tour to Paris. But before he went off with Diaghilev, he took Moshe Chagall on as a painter. And this is the work that Bakst had done. You can see it's a little surrealist element here, a countryside scene, some ruins, some poplar trees. And if you look very carefully between the poplar trees, you can see a floating figure. And this rang a bell with this young man. In Bakst's studio, he came across lots of works. There was Gauguin, and he recognized this self-portrait of Gauguin, and he learnt a little bit about him, that he was a very flamboyant, self-centered man with a drooping moustache, a sidelong glance, and hair over his forehead in Gauguin's self-portrait. And Moshe Chagall says, well, let me try that myself. And there he paints himself à la Gauguin, but mischievously holds a slice of watermelon to declare his independence from his master there. Knowing that the action is in Paris, he thinks he can only make progress as an artist if he changes his name from Moshe Chagall, which didn't seem to have much future as an artist, to Marc Chagall, which sounded much more French. And so before going, he does this picture here of a painting, his father there creeping out from under the covers, his mother having given birth to their 9th child. And there, peering through the window, is Moshe Chagall's uncle, and there he is himself standing on tiptoe, recalling what it was like in the old days before he went off to Paris. And in Paris, he met Modigliani and Picasso, and among others he met were the Delauneys, Robert and Sonia Delaunay, who became lifelong friends of Chagall. Why? Because Sonia had Russian roots, and there was a bond between them. Cubism was all the rage, and Delaunay's color theories greatly influenced him, and now in Paris, Chagall is beginning to paint, finding his own feet. There's a purely Parisian scene, a little bit of an acknowledgement to Cubism, which he regarded as sterile, and he didn't really embrace Cubism, but he does just a little bit here, because after all, it's the in thing. And there he paints himself at the bottom, Chagall looking in two directions, one towards Paris and the other, of course, to his native Vitebsk, where the roofs are covered in snow and there's a fiddler tapping out a tune. And now finally he's getting it all together under the Delaunay's influence. If you're familiar with Delaunay's work, he had a color theory.